My guest today is Professor Katarina Juselius, who is Professor Emeritus of Econometrics and Empirical Economics at the University of Copenhagen. Her work has been on empirical macro models and associated issues. Welcome, Katarina.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So we want to talk about one of your recent survey paper, Searching for a Theory That Fits the Data. I love it. A personal research odyssey. This has been sort of a problem with economics, not just economics, actually. It is now almost every scientific discipline. Replication has become a problem for papers. So things work beautifully when you write a paper, and then when somebody else tries to do it, it doesn't quite work. so you're looking for the data that fits your hypothesis in some way. But we're talking about here the co-integrated vector autoregressive methodology, CBAR methodology, and how it has evolved over the last 30 years. You say it describes major steps in the economic development, discusses problems to be solved when confronting theory with the data, and as a solution proposes a so-called theory-consistent CBAR scenario. As I mentioned, Katarina, I had a little bit of macroeconomics in the mid-90s, and I haven't touched macroeconomics since then. So I probably lost most of it. But before we get the details of the paper, could you so what exactly is CBAR? How do you describe that?
Well, CBAR, or CBAR, as I usually call it for short, is a time series process, autoregressive time series process, which is in its simplest form, it's just what you call a VAR, autoregressive vector autoregressive process. But the C stands for co-integration, and that means in the sense that we are able to say reformulate the model so that we can distinguish between structures in the long run, which are described by the co-integrated relations, and structures in the short run, and even sometimes also in the medium run. And that means in the sense that you can suddenly ask a large number of questions, which you couldn't do before, because you can separate between the say the long run and the feedback dynamics to the long run. You can actually ask questions about the shocks which are say pushing the economy and so on. So it actually offered me with numerous new questions to ask to economic data. This was really exciting.
Yeah, and so CBAR, so one of the issues that you talk about in the paper is that we have these theories that sometimes when you tested the data, it doesn't appear to work, even though most people seems to believe in those theories.
Yeah.
I have to say, I was at University of Chicago, so I just mentioned that so people will understand my bias in some sense in our conversation. But you say these theories, for example, Milton Friedman's monetarism, monetaristic inflation, for instance, doesn't quite work, you say. So how do you reach that conclusion?
Sorry, what was the last question?
So how do you demonstrate that data is not really fitting that theory?
I think one has to understand that, say, traditionally, economists usually looked at one or a few aspects of the theory model, and they actually took the model to the data with the purpose of just answering that question. What we do is a more general more general approach, and that means, in the sense that what you get is one could say, you can answer the hypothesis of interest, but you also get a lot of additional information, say like feedback dynamics, and there are many things in the economic model that people usually say impose on the data from the outset. For example, you assume that you know which are the driving forces. You know also how the the dynamic adjustment is taking place, and you assume that there are long-run price neutrality. You impose that on the data as well. And I do nothing of this. I just start from the scratch and test everything first from the outset. And that means, in a sense, say now in relation to Friedman's monetary theory, because I used Romer's book on macroeconomics, and I took one chapter from that book, and I said I will now try to somehow check everything in that chapter to see if it actually works. And then I found a stable money-demand relation, which people then said it was a prerequisite for monetary policy to work. And I was very happy. But then it turned out that, for example, that money stock, instead of being the one that pushes inflation, was the one that adjusted. And so on. So the exogenous forces were very different from what you would have expected if the theory was okay.
And so this is sort of a general problem of generalization, right? So you start with a hypothesis, you can prove or disprove that hypothesis with some data. But the theory itself doesn't generalize. We have the same problem in machine learning, for example. We can take some data and fit a beautiful model, beautiful machine learning model, and then it fails when it's shown data that it hasn't seen yet, right? So generalization is a broad sort of mathematical problem.
Yeah,
and
it is.
And I think it's sort of the same issue here, right?
Yeah, sure. Because, I mean, economy is very complex, and it's not easy to somehow sort out what is correct or what is not correct. And the theory generally is so much simpler in a way. And if you take the macroeconomic data, for example, you know that there is just one data set. Because, I mean, there are one series of unemployment, there is one series of GDP growth, there is one series of interest rate, and so on. But in order to understand these, you very often have many different economic models. So there are one data and several models, economic models. And in my view, I thought it was extremely important not to assume from the outset one theory, but instead to formulate something, say a model that was so general that it could encompass, say, several of or all the economic models. And by testing, one would then, in the end, come closer and closer to the one that was, say, the best empirical description. Right, that was the idea.
Yeah, and so can we go back to sort of the guts of CBAR? So you said it's an autoregressive methodology, co-integrated, meaning there are multiple attributes that you are sort of bringing together. So one of the issues, as you say, is that you have to have something that works in the short run, in the medium run, and in the long run.
Yeah.
If I take I guess, let me ask you this way. There is a bias toward elegance, right? We see this in cosmology, we see this in physics. But I think there's a similar concept in economics too, that nobody likes complex theories. You know, if I come up with an equation that has, 50 and 20 variables in it, it seems much less elegant to somebody saying it works this way, right?
Yeah, it
So,
is.
so the seeking elegance probably leading us to non-generalizable theories, and once it gets a life, I guess it continues. People start to believe in it,
Yeah.
and it goes on like that, right? Is that the issue?
That is a very adequate description, I think, because things are so complex. And of course, I mean, we all want to make it more simple in order to grasp the complexity. And I think it should be made simple, but not too simple, because at one point you lose something very important.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, and that is exactly what I have been, when I say searching for a theory that fits the data, that is exactly what I have been searching for. Say the theory which is not too simple, but still not too complex, because if it's too complex, it means that you can't grasp it any longer.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So could we talk a little bit, Katarina, about sort of the inflation, let's say? I know that you looked at many countries. You looked at Denmark against Germany, and you sort of tested some of the predictions of the theory,
Yeah.
and it doesn't quite show it, right?
No, that is an understatement. No, because I tried to understand, because I first fully believed in monetary inflation, in Friedman's claim that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary problem. And to some extent, I might even believe it now also, but in a completely different context. But anyway, I tried to see first with Danish data. Is it the case that, say, money expansion in excess of, say, the long-run stable money-demand relation actually leads to inflation? And there was absolutely no evidence of it, so zero. And so I said, well, perhaps it is because Denmark is a very small country and small economy, and we are very dependent on Germany. So perhaps I should look at German money demand instead. And then I found something which I think actually was quite interesting, because I found that, first of all, that there was a clear structural break in the beginning of the 80s, and they had to split the sample. And then the first part of the sample, in a sense, fitted very well with what you would have expected. I mean, money was actually causing inflation, and it seemed like a monetary rule was sufficient to control inflation and so on. But after 83, I mean, I still got evidence of a monetary policy rule, but it had no effect on inflation any longer. And that was, in my view, very puzzling. And in the end, I mean, I think I came to the conclusion that it was because in the mid-80s, Germany and Europe generally deregulated financial movements. And that clearly caused a fundamental change in the macroeconomic mechanisms.
And so, in some sense, everybody is right. Then, when Friedman was proposing it, there was evidence of monetary inflation. When we say inflation here, we're talking about consumer price inflation, right?
Yeah, I have looked basically at that, because it's more coherently defined over different economies. I mean, there always also the problem of measurements in economics, because the economic variables are not always, I mean, measuring what the theory would expect them to do.
Yeah. And so you
Yeah.
say in the mid 80s, there was a structural change, sort of financial deregulation, a
Yes.
structural change. So what is the mechanism? What specifically changed this connection between expansion of money and inflation?
I think in my view, what I find is that the strongest effect was in the foreign currency markets, because I mean there you have the nominal exchange rate, and it should somehow reflect the relative costs between two economies or two areas, and it wasn't. I didn't find that effect at all. Instead, of course, nominal exchange rate is also being influenced by speculative transactions in the foreign exchange, and they seem to be so much more dominant, and they didn't drive the nominal exchange rate back to fundamental values. On the contrary, there was a clear evidence that nominal exchange rates were moving away from long-run fundamental values. And of course, that has enormous implications for importing and exporting enterprises, because they have to compete in a very competitive environment. And it basically, essentially, according to my findings, prevented them to increase prices in order to say, in order to compensate for the big movements in nominal exchange rates. And I think that is the closest I can come to an explanation why, I mean, inflation was kept so low, because you could see also that instead of changing prices, they improved productivity, which is the other possible solution. And we also saw in that period that enterprises were outsourcing production. They were asking, say, the employees to work very hard to produce more per hour than before, and they were say replacing also employees, workers with robots, and so on and so on. And all these in order to somehow improve productivity and to be able to compete in a very competitive market where they couldn't really, where nominal exchange rate did not do the job for them.
Right. And so are you arguing, Catherine, if I understand this correctly, so mid 80s,
Yeah.
did the speculation in the currency markets suddenly increase quite a bit? I'm just, what was the sort of the regime shift from a mechanistic perspective that broke this connection?
I mean, it was the financial deregulation of capital movements. So, I mean, I can give one example for Denmark. I'm actually from Finland, and I moved to Denmark in the beginning of the 80s. And I then wanted to take, I think it was 50,000 Finnish mark, which is not a lot of money, to move it to Denmark. And I had to have the permission from the central bank to do it. And nowadays, I mean, if you think of the capital that moves across borders in a fraction of a second, it's just huge. So it was at that point, I mean, it was a very different economy. And of course, because the capital could not move freely over the country borders, it was also possible somehow to keep it in the country, to have competitive devaluations and so on. All this was impossible after you opened up the economies. And it solved some problems, but my claim is that it also created some problems.
Right. Yeah, your story brings memories to me, Katarina. So I moved from India to the United States in the mid 80s, and I had to get $25.
Yeah.
And in $25, I had to get some sort of central bank clearance.
Exactly. Yeah.
In the mid 80s. So,
Yeah.
so all those sort of constraints went away. And so in some sense, money creating inflation was true in such a very constrained, localized markets, right? Money cannot go anywhere.
Yeah, and I actually I have to say that I'm not even terribly convinced that it created inflation then, but of course it allowed for say inflationary expectations, and they were the ones that actually were important.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it's consumer price inflation. I think you make a distinction. And I was thinking when I was reading the paper, we went through an experiment in the US, and I guess the EU has done similar, a few $1 trillion of stimulus as part of the pandemic. It hasn't really gone into consumer price inflation, but it has really gone into asset price inflation, right?
Exactly.
Real estate is through the roof, and even stock markets and so on. So that is sort of proving what you were hypothesizing, I think.
And that is lots of evidence of say excess money leading to say stock price inflation and house price inflation also. So, but not the consumer price inflation.
Yeah, it's without knowing all the details, it's a bit counterintuitive.
It is. But the moment you start really understanding it, it's not counterintuitive any longer. I think it is very reasonable. But also when you have so much house price inflation and so much stock price inflation just now, I mean you actually have no long run price neutrality. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that is something that is just routinely assumed. And if you do not allow the data to speak freely about it, you will not really realize that that is a very, very important problem to solve. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it has a lot of implications for policy. So would you say when the money bucket is taken away by the central banks, would you say that if it is sort of artificial asset price inflation, would you say that would go back?
That's a very hard question.
I'm trying to make some money in the stock market.
Because I mean, one can point out what is, say, problematic, and whether the policy then works is much harder because there are so many things to somehow consider. And so I have spent my life trying to understand structures, but I would be scared to death to have to to come with policy advice, because I think that is very, very difficult.
Yeah, but in the status quo, I guess this gives central banks, when they look at the typical metrics like CPI and so on, you don't see inflation. So they can sort of go back and say, there's no inflation. We can continue at low interest rates forever. And
Exactly.
I think that's what's happening in many cases, right?
Yeah, I think what one could say, well, we need to have, for example, you could have higher reserve ratios, force them onto the private banks, so that, for example, that would put a damper on house prices. You could say, well, you have to have 20%. First, you have to save 20%, and then you can get 80% in loan, for example. There we also somehow put a downward pressure on the house prices and so on. I think when it comes to stock prices, then I think to some extent there it's a question of trying to restrict, say, credit that goes into the stock market, and how to do it is not so easy. But for example, Tobin originally, when he talked about his so-called Tobin tax, he suggested it to be on foreign currency transactions, because he was actually worried about the fact that speculative behavior in the foreign currency market could actually lead to this kind of persistent imbalances as we see. And I think that would be such a transaction tax, I think, would be really very good.
So speculations and speculations leading to sort of long deviations or excursions from expectations. But again, from an intuition perspective, if there's speculation, that bubble has to burst at some point, right?
Yeah, they do, and of course, I mean, you have these very long swings, and you have, if you look at the data, you will see that stock prices, I mean, I have a graph that goes from just after the Second World War up to today, and I took Dow Jones stock price index, and I graphed it in relation to GDP, and you will see there are some really super cycles in the data. First, I mean, after World War II, when you had to rebuild Europe, and after the war and so on, when everything went up. Then came the 70s with the inflationary expectations and high interest rates and so on, and a long downward swing down. And then in the 80s, when you had deregulation of financial markets and an enormous credit expansion, and then you had the long upward spring, and you still have it. But on these, say, super cycles, you see these medium run cycles, which are perhaps, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years long. So there is a lot of speculation creates a lot of movements in the data, which seem to be, in my view, are not related to anything, say, fundamental.
Right. Yeah. So I can understand the super cycles. I think it's sort of self-reinforcing, right? Once you are in a sort of a long-term cycle, you borrow, you lever up. You start to get more returns, you level further up. And at some point, at the top of the mountain, things come rolling down. We don't know when that is. Timing that is really, really difficult. So these super cycles are sort of self-reinforcing for people, right? Yeah,
but so are also, I think, the medium run, say the 6, 7, 8 year long cycles, because in a sense, I mean, it is expectations in the market, and if expectations now are that the prices go up, they will actually act accordingly, and then prices will go up, and that will confirm they were correct in the expectations, and that process is to some extent self-reinforcing. And you can see it very, very, very strongly, for example, in connection with the IT bubble, that was a huge bubble.
And so when you're in the bubble, you don't know it. I mean, we see the same thing in financial markets, right? So Generally speaking, when markets are going up, people take more leverage, they invest more, and things go up even further.
Yes.
Some sort of curious phenomenon in some ways, Katerina, that has happened more recently, which is there are a lot more retail investors in the markets today. They have these apps on their iPhones, and they can essentially day trade. Some estimates say there are 25 million day traders in the U.S. alone.
Yeah.
And so that dynamic actually, in some sense, changed because it used to be the hedge funds sort of pumping up things in one direction until they leave. But now the retail market is, sort of changed that, I think.
Yeah.
And so the speculation requires sort of concentration. In other words, are, the companies have to be big, right, to play in the markets. And to have a real effect on speculation for a longer time, they have to be big, right?
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I mean, I would be very afraid to answer these questions because, I mean, I can see the imbalances created, but it's not really my research area. So I will be. I would not like to say anything which is just my own guesses.
Yeah, so we know speculation exists. So going back to the CBAR methodology,
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about, so you're talking about here sort of a difference between rational expectations hypothesis and sort of imperfect information, right?
Imperfect knowledge, yeah, based.
So could you contrast between the two? What do you mean by these two things?
Well, first of all, I think I have to explain why I got so happy about these imperfect knowledge based expectations when I stumbled on them. And that because what was problematic in the empirical analysis was that I realized, for example, the big parity relationships like the say uncovered interest rate parity, the purchasing power parity, the Fisher parity, the term spread, and so on. These parities were generally assumed to be stationary, meaning that you could move away from them, but you would get back to fundamental in a reasonably short period. And when I looked at the data, they were clearly these deviations from say equilibrium states. They're very, very persistent. Also too persistent that one could say, oh, it's just because there are some sort of inertia and so on. They were more persistent than that, and I had to understand why they were so persistent. Meaning, in a sense, that I had a non-stationary deviation from equilibrium,
Right.
and I said, well, say the rational expectations hypothesis usually said that, well, economic actors know these parities, they know they are stationary, hence it would be irrational if they drive prices away from that. They could just be pushed off, but then they will start adjusting back again. That would be rational. And I said, this is not what I see in the data. And then I came across some work by Roman Friedman from New York University and Michael Goldberg, and they were discussing this kind of imperfect knowledge-based expectations, and they had also illustrated it with an example of purchasing power parity and interest rate, uncovered interest rate parity, which was exactly the same problem I had been working with. So when they were saying, oh, you know, we have this empirical evidence, and we don't know really what to do with it. And I said, I actually have exactly the same, and I know how to analyze it empirically. So we started working, collaborating.
Yeah, and so these relationships, purchasing power parity, uncovered interest rate parity, and so on. So there is an expectation, as you say, they are stable. I don't know if stable is the right term, but stationary.
Stationary. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if when it takes a deviation from expectation, it is expected to come back. But what you're saying is that we don't see these things coming back to an equilibrium point.
No.
And so when they take an excursion, it is sort of a structural change. So I mean, I'm thinking about PPP, for example. The little I remember about PPP is also related to currency differentials between countries and so on, right? So there are different mechanisms, at least on the surface, that would bring it back, but doesn't appear to happen.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's not really a structural break or something, but it is just the question that the theory used to explain, say, the movements, I think needs to be modified. So instead of rational expectations, I think if I replace those with imperfect knowledge-based expectations, and I have two papers, one where I try to explain these, say, the PPP and UIP with rational expectations monetary model, and one where I use the imperfect knowledge-based expectations. And empirically, I reject basically all hypotheses in the first case, and I cannot reject say any of the hypotheses in the second case, because it really explains the data extremely well. But I should also say it was a major task to formulate the imperfect knowledge-based expectations into what you also already mentioned, a theory consistent CBAR scenario. It was very, very difficult, but I did it, and it just, the data just completely seemed to fit.
Yeah, I mean, without knowing a lot about it, Katarina, it makes sort of intuitive sense to me. So you call it technology-based expectations?
No, I think it is the question that maybe people are doing all this, and humans are not always that rational. They are rational in a sense, but possibly not rational the way, say, the economic model prescribes it. Because in a sense, I just have to. I was from the outset, I was a little bit. I didn't really believe in rational expectations, because I had so many economic colleagues, and nobody behaved like that.
Right.
So I think there is because in the imperfect knowledge-based expectations there is a very important assumption in that economic actors are loss averse, not just risk averse, but loss averse. And that means that, when you drive, when nominal exchange rate, for example, moves away from relative prices, so that you have, say, a serious degree of real exchange rate persistence. When nominal exchange rate moves away too far away, then of course, I mean, then you got the sleepless nights. Investors begin to say, oh, this will not really end well. And that means that they experience what we call loss aversion. When the gap effect becomes very, very large, then the loss aversion sets in. And that has a lot of explanatory power.
There's sort of a positive feedback there too, right? So when things move in the wrong direction, there's loss aversion that sort of get positive feedback and it continues in that direction, right?
Yeah, because I always look at the problem in a system, and that means that you can have positive feedback in one direction, and then suddenly in another direction, you get this negative feedback. You get back something. You get a reaction that goes back to steady state. So, for example, in the PPP UIP example, you have interest rates and you have exchange rate. And what I have found, that is with respect to US UK data, at in the medium run, it is exchange rate changes that are exogenous that drives the market. In the very long run, it is interest rates, the nominal interest rates, that takes over. So they change in the medium run, you have one sort of exogenous forces. In the long run, you have another one. And that can explain the movements I think, very precisely, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's sort of changing the gears in an automobile, right? You're going in the second gear for a while, and then you shift it to third gear. And it's sort of a regime change, and different factors, different attributes work. And so this is why you're saying, from a theory perspective, suppose I come up with a long run theory, and it doesn't explain anything in the medium term or the short term.
No, nothing.
It is sort of fitting. It's sort of fitting the data to just answer that question. But would you say? So if I take a model like that, which is sort of simplistic, looking at some horizon that is very defined. Does it work from a policy perspective? Suppose my policy requirement is a very long run policy. So I just need a long run prediction. I don't care what happens in the medium term or short term. Can you take the sort of status quo models in that context?
I can explain, say, using the empirical results. I can explain what happens in the long run and then in the medium run, and meaning that somebody who is very good at policy should be able to say, well, then I think we should do this and this, but they dare not. Don't ask me about policy advice, because in a sense, I would not really dare to give you.
Yeah. What you're saying, I think, if I understand this correctly, Katarina, that if you take sort of the status quo theories and you say, let me make a prediction based on these theories, and let me test those predictions, what you're saying is that you don't see those predictions to be true, right? If you look at real data.
No, I think the reason why I'm very often very reluctant to come with predictions of what will happen is that, when you have very persistent deviations from say a long run relation, it can only be so persistent because it is compensated by a similar persistence somewhere else. So because otherwise, if you have just one, if only say, nominal exchange rate would move persistently. They couldn't really do it because, I mean, there are forces in the market that would somehow make it impossible. But because you have also persistence in interest rate differential between the economy, and that compensates. So that together they can somehow, it looks like a certain balance, and it can actually go on for a very, very long time, because, I mean, they keep each other in balance, but usually it is a very fragile balance, because
Right.
because it consists of two imbalances, and you need just one shock somewhere in the system, and it can collapse. But it's almost impossible to know when. Yeah.
It's a timing that's it's a timing
The
that's the
timing,
problem.
I would be very rich if I would know the timing.
So it's a bit like winding a spring. We don't know when it's going to break.
Yeah,
We can really make predictions. If I say x plus y is a constant, and I see x, very different from equilibrium levels,
yeah,
I cannot really say x is going to come back to the equilibrium level, because what you're saying is that y is now compensating
yeah,
for x's move away from equilibrium,
yeah,
and that persistence could be there for a long time. So
yeah.
you might die waiting for it, waiting
Exactly.
for that persistence to break. Yeah.
Just as an example, I mean, I told my friends already end of the 90s that we will soon have a financial crisis. And it took 10 years. And then it came. But at that time, I mean, they many times, oh yes, but you said that already last year or the year before. So I stopped saying anything in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes a lot more intuitive sense to me now. So when there is persistent variations, it appears to be self-reinforcing in some level, because there's speculation,
Yeah.
and speculation is going to get higher leverage, and so it's a continue to deviate away.
Yeah.
And at some point it's going to break, but we have no clue as to what that timing might be, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a problem.
That's that's
And in my view, I think policy should be not trying to somehow guess when the break comes, but instead avoid these persistent deviations.
Yeah, so going back to policy again, from a central bank perspective, based on your sort of hypothesis here and ideas, what would be, how would the central bank policies change? Um,
Yeah, I think first of all, central banks should give up the idea that the main thing is to control inflation, because that means that the focus is, in a sense, on something which is the market is already somehow takes responsibility for that one. But I think they should be much more worried about house price inflation and stock price inflation. And in a sense, this is also something we discuss a lot here in Denmark. And you can say that, well, we have house prices have increased a lot. And the question is it a bubble, or is it just an imbalance? I would say it is an imbalance, because we had also a period when we had a real bubble, that was before 2007. And you can easily see that you cannot explain the increase in prices there with, say, the level of interest rates and the level of income and the level of financial wealth, all of them influence house prices and the demand for housing. So in a sense, many of my colleagues will say, well, you know, we can explain the house prices, but still, if you look at how much house prices have increased compared to consumer prices, I mean, they have increased enormously much more. And then we say, yeah, but of course, I mean, since the interest rate is now so low, it doesn't matter because they can still manage to pay interest rate payments and pay off the debt. But the problem is, of course, at the moment this the housing market is subject to a crisis and prices start falling, a lot of people will suddenly have debt which is greater than the house price, and they will be insolvent, and that has enormous implications. And we saw it already, I mean, in the 2007 crisis, and so many people went bankrupt, and they could not get divorced because they could sell the house, and so on and so on. And many enterprises could not obtain a new loan because the loan they had was bigger than the worth of the estate they had. So in that sense, I think it is an imbalance, and we should not allow imbalances. That is my.
Yeah, I was also wondering, Katarina, there's a little bit of a structural change, meaning if the pandemics are sort of a systemic thing, you know, it's going to be with us for a long time, let's say. We see a movement away from cities into suburbs. And if people in general now evaluate their decision to buy a home to be of higher importance, let's say. So given a set of choices, they pick the house buying decision to be more dominant. In other words, there's a higher demand for houses suddenly because of the pandemic. And that is going to drive prices up too, right?
Yeah, because I mean, we also have to take account of the fact that during the lockdown of the economies, and people could not really spend the money because they could not travel, they could not go to restaurants. They had, I mean, the amount of private saving is enormous in this period. And at the same time, you have an interest rate which is basically almost negative, zero and negative. And you have a lot of time because, I mean, you cannot do so much. So you have to spend your time on something. And it could, for example, be to let's now buy a new house and a beautiful house. And in Denmark also the demand for housing increased enormously in this period.
Right. Yeah, as you say, it's the leverage issue. So if you're taking debt, expecting the house is worth something. And if there is a shock in the system and prices come down, then you're suddenly insolvent. And it's the same thing that happened in 2007. There was an additional problem of all the mortgages being bundled up, that people buying those mortgages did not know what they were buying. I don't know what's going on now. One thing we know is that we don't learn from our mistakes. We will make them again. There's no question in my mind that this is really happening.
Somehow I think people do not believe house prices will fall. It's so fundamental somewhere, and that is also a little bit irrational because house prices increase and house prices fall. But people do not believe it, and I think there are expectations that you can always invest in real estate because that is safe.
Yeah, so in conclusion, Katerina, could you sort of summarize? Let me see if I understand this correctly. So correct me if this is not the right way to think about it.
Yeah.
Um, in most economic theories, we have some simplified assumptions, such as people make rational decisions, rational choices, and so on. These simplified theories are sort of fitting for some specific question that the theory is trying to answer. So they're not generalizable. They are, heavily fitted for some specific problem. And so both of our assumptions and the methodology in the economic theory arena appear to be faulty. And if so, none of these things really work as we expect them to work in a very general sense, in all regimes, in all time horizons, and so on. So then the question is, can we have an alternative? Can we have an alternative view as to how things work? And you have some hypotheses there, right? And the related question then would be, if this were true, what are the implications for policy from a central bank? So do you want to sort of summarize your hypothesis and maybe some ideas about policy again?
Well, I think one has to first of all understand that the economic models and the empirical reality, or the empirical statistical models, they are two very different entities, because in many ways. And you possibly also realize that I talked about my reading Trygve Hovelmo's old monograph, The Probability Approach to Economics, which influenced me a lot, because there he actually discusses, say, the difference between inference based on experimental data and inference based on non-experimental data. And sure, macro data are non-experimental because we cannot control them. We cannot control the ceteris paribus assumptions and so on. So we have to have a different approach. And when you ask about the theory and my work, because I tried to address this question by formulating this, say, the theory consistent CBAR scenarios, because in that sense, in those, I tried to address everything that one could address, all the hypotheses that you can address using, say, our model, the CBAR model. And the scenario is a set of hypotheses that somehow describe what would we find, what empirical regularities would we find in the data if the theory model was correct. And there I have come to the conclusion that if you talk about macroeconomics, then I find very often that Keynesian economics explains the data much better than, say, the neoclassical models that we usually nowadays entertain. I would also say that Keynesian, old-time Keynesian economics is not sufficient, because we also have to include the financial market behavior much better in such models. We also have to replace rational expectations with imperfect knowledge-based expectations. And you said that we are not describing rational behavior. And in a sense, I think I am actually explaining rational behavior. What is irrational is the idea to think that economic agents are believing in the very abstract models that economists usually like, and use them when they forecast the the future. I think that is it. This is it. It's called rational, but I think that is irrational. So in that sense, what I would say, I would rather actually rely on Keynesian economics, and I would include financial market behavior much more in macroeconomic models than is usually done, and in a different way than it's done just now. And I would try to introduce imperfect knowledge-based expectations.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes, so one aspect is really the financial markets have a huge effect, huge impact on outcomes, right? And we also have significant concentration in financial markets, with investment banks, hedge funds, and so on. And so behaviors of large financial market participants do have a huge impact on outcomes. And that is not in the models, I would imagine. Right?
Yeah. And it needs to be, because, I mean usually say traditionally the models were built based on the assumption of say two driving forces, the real productivity based force and the inflationary based force. But obviously we need the third force, which is the financial market force, in order to understand our economies. And it is not just that you can say the causality comes purely from financial markets to the real economy, because there are feedback effects, I mean, both ways. So in that sense, it's quite complex.
Yeah, and you mentioned from a central bank perspective, attempting to control consumer price inflation seems like a lost cause.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that central banks should really pay attention to asset price inflation, so real estate, stock markets, because if there is some sort of a break in those markets, it has huge effect on the entire economy, right? So, but can they really do anything? I mean, what would they do if they sort of see this bubbles, speculative bubbles form?
Yeah, because I think they have the power to influence leverage in say private bank lending. Has been, I mean, almost there have been almost no restrictions. So in that sense, when I started first my academic studies, I remember that there was this idea that the velocity of money should be more or less stationary. So if you look at the velocity of money today, I mean, it is an enormously increasing variable. I mean, it has an enormous trend. And that is because the leverage has been completely wild.
Yeah, so these metrics are useful as a diagnostic. It's useful as a diagnostic for central banks to really think about. But it's not, as if I understand this correctly, it's not about consumer price inflation. It's really about asset price.
It's about assets, because I think the consumer price inflation has to do with speculation in the financial market, in the foreign exchange.
Foreign exchange, yeah.
Foreign exchange, yes. Yeah.
Excellent.
Basically.
Yeah, this has been great, Katarina. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Okay. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you.
Yeah. So bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.